Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating, really hard look at one of the most debated figures in all of maritime history. You know, when the RMS Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, it took the lives of over 1,500 people to the bottom of the Atlantic. But right at the center of this monumental tragedy is the man who was in charge of the whole shebang, Captain Edward James Smith. Today, we're going to unpack his highly controversial sailing decisions on that fateful night. We're peeling back the historical layers to understand exactly what went wrong, what drove his choices, and how a routine crossing turned into an absolute catastrophe. Okay, let's dive into this. The central question we have to ask ourselves right out of the gate is this: how does a Commodore, a guy with an absolute lifetime of maritime experience, steer the world's greatest, most technologically advanced ship directly into a deadly, well-documented ice field? Was it just pure hubris? Was it gross negligence? Or was he kind of caught up in a web of cascading circumstances that were far beyond his control? Here's our agenda for today. 1. The veteran's final voyage. 2. Ignoring the ice warnings. 3. The need for speed. 4. Leaving the bridge. And 5. The inquiries and the verdict. Section 1. The veteran's final voyage. 40. That is the massive number of years of sailing experience Captain Smith actually had under his belt. He was 62 years old, and he'd been the highly respected Commodore of the White Star Fleet since 1904. In fact, he was so beloved by the high society passengers of the era that he was widely known as the millionaire's captain. I mean, the elite would literally change their travel plans just to make sure they sailed under his command. This maiden voyage of the Titanic was supposed to be his triumphant retirement trip, the crowning achievement of a stellar career. This wasn't some rookie making a careless mistake. This was a seasoned professional at the absolute peak of his influence. And honestly, that makes his ultimate failure a truly tragic narrative of hubris. But to truly understand his choices on that voyage, we absolutely must grasp the 1912 maritime mindset. We can't view Smith purely as a villain, right? We have to see him as a product of his era. Back then, there was this supreme confidence in modern engineering. I mean, the Titanic was widely dubbed unsinkable by the press and the public alike. Standard practice relied heavily on the naked eye of lookouts stationed high up in the crow's nest. And ironically, they routinely sailed without binoculars, believing they were tools strictly for identifying objects they'd already spotted, not for scanning the horizon. But most importantly, speed was consistently prioritized over extreme caution. This was all driven by a widely held belief that if the weather was clear and the sea was calm, a ship of that size was inherently safe. Section 2. Ignoring the ice warnings. So throughout the day, up to 9 ice warnings were received by the Titanic. Just look at this rapid succession. At 1:30 p.m., the RMS Baltic reports icebergs. Hours later, at 9:40 p.m., the SS Mesaba warns of extensive pack ice directly in the Titanic's immediate path. But tragically, this absolutely crucial message is received and then never delivered to the bridge. At 10:55 p.m., the SS Californian reports they're fully stopped and surrounded by ice. And then, less than an hour later, at 11:40 p.m., the fatal collision occurs. With all this incoming data, we really have to ask why these mounting warnings weren't heeded by command. Keep out. Shut up. I'm working. Keep out. Shut up. I'm working. Cape Race. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer chaos happening behind the scenes. Those words were literally snapped by Titanic's senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, to the nearby SS Californian when they tried to urgently warn him about the ice field. You have to understand the environment of the Marconi room at that time. The wireless was a very new technology, and these operators were employed by the Marconi company, not the White Star Line. The equipment had actually broken down the day before, leaving Phillips completely overwhelmed and working through a massive backlog of frivolous commercial telegrams sent by wealthy passengers. In this nascent era of radio, ship-to-ship safety warnings were practically treated as a professional courtesy, falling way behind the priority of paying passenger messages. Section 3. The need for speed. Here we see a terrifying juxtaposition that really highlights the core conflict of the disaster. On one hand, you have 5 to 9 incoming safety warnings regarding extensive, highly dangerous ice fields lying directly ahead. On the other hand, you have immense commercial pressure. Aboard the ship, traveling as a passenger, was J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. Ismay relentlessly pressured Captain Smith to maintain high speeds in order to arrive in New York a full day ahead of schedule. He wanted to surprise the public, grab international headlines, and secure the White Star Line's dominance over their rivals.
It's just a tragic example of prioritizing a company's commercial reputation ahead of fundamental safety, creating a deadly, compounding domino effect.
But before we completely condemn Captain Smith for maintaining that speed, let's look closely at the established standard practice of the time. Captain J.B. Ranson of the RMS Baltic later testified, "We go full speed whether there is ice reported or not." He explicitly stated under oath that as long as the weather was perfectly clear, he maintained his course and his speed. So Smith's decision to barrel forward into the night wasn't an isolated, rogue act of madness. It was actually the fully accepted, albeit incredibly flawed, standard maritime operating procedure of 1912. The night of April 14th was bitterly cold, but it was also perfectly, deceptively clear. Section 4. Leaving the bridge. At 9:20 p.m., as the Titanic races toward known ice, Captain Smith leaves the bridge. Why? To attend a lavish, high-society dinner party hosted in his honor by wealthy passenger George Widener, representing the absolute cream of 1912 society. He essentially prioritized socializing with the elite over commanding the bridge in an active danger zone. Now, he did check in with his officers afterward, but he ultimately retired to his cabin for the night. Despite knowing there was ice ahead, and despite the water being flat, calm, a condition which ironically makes icebergs much harder to spot because there are no whitewater waves breaking at their base, he confidently left the largest moving object ever built solely in the hands of his junior officers. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer speed of the catastrophe and this minute-by-minute breakdown once the iceberg was struck at 11:40 p.m. Because the ship was moving so incredibly fast, it just couldn't turn in time and instead sideswiped the ice, scraping and buckling nearly 300 feet of the starboard hull. By midnight, the forward watertight compartments were rapidly filling with freezing water. By 2 a.m., the sheer weight of the flooded bow was pulling the ship down so far that the massive propellers were lifting entirely out of the water. And by 2:20 a.m., the greatest ship in the world slipped completely beneath the surface. Notice how the watertight compartments actually failed here. It's like a giant, tragic puzzle. The Titanic was masterfully designed to survive if its 4 forward compartments were flooded, but the high-speed impact against the iceberg tore open 6 of them. As the water rushed in, it eventually spilled over the tops of the transverse bulkheads. Because the bulkheads didn't reach all the way up to the uppermost decks, the water relentlessly pulled the bow down, which just caused the water to spill into the next compartment and the next and the next. It was an unstoppable, fatal chain reaction caused directly by the physics of hitting an immovable object at 21.5 knots. Section 5. The Inquiries and the Verdict. The official investigations following the sinking were complex and, in a lot of ways, kind of contradictory. The U.S. inquiry effectively ruled the disaster an act of God, concluding that since Captain Smith strictly followed standard maritime practice, no one could be held legally negligent for the sinking. The British inquiry, however, took a slightly different, more forward-looking angle. They agreed that Smith had indeed followed long-standing practice that hadn't previously been proven unsafe, but they issued a stark, industry-altering warning. Doing the exact same thing in the future would, without a doubt, be legally considered gross negligence. Because of this, Smith was simultaneously viewed as a standard, rule-following operator and the tragic catalyst for sweeping, permanent changes in global maritime law. So the crucial point is that this disaster wasn't just born from one bad decision. It was a massive, fatal domino effect. We had a national coal strike in the UK that forced rushed, chaotic crew changes right before departure. We had relentless commercial pressure from figures like ISME to maintain dangerous speeds for public relations. We had overworked wireless operators prioritizing passenger gossip over vital safety warnings, operating in a system that didn't even require a 24-hour watch. And above all, weaving through every single decision was a deeply overconfident maritime culture that genuinely, fundamentally believed a modern ship could truly be unsinkable. Which leaves us with our final thought to ponder. Was Captain Smith simply a victim of 1912's deeply flawed maritime culture, doing exactly what any other seasoned captain of his era would have done under those specific conditions? Or, by ignoring the ice warnings, bowing to commercial pressure, maintaining his speed, and leaving the bridge, was he the principal architect of the disaster? Weigh the historical evidence, and let this incredible story challenge what you think you know about leadership and responsibility. Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep exploring.